Good evening, friend. If you're here tonight, you've likely already settled into something soft. Maybe a blanket. Maybe the familiar quiet of your room. Maybe the scent of lavender lingers in the air, or the last page of a book lies resting beside you. Wherever you are, this moment is yours. You're safe here, and we're about to wander back in time, not to the throne rooms of kings or the pages of epic tales, but to something far more ordinary ... and far more human. Tonight, I'd like to tell you a story not of swords or saints, but of sickness and survival, of whispered prayers over fevered brows, of strange smelling poultices and curious brews stirred in cracked wooden bowls, of a world where doctors were few, hospitals were monasteries, and healing was as much faith as it was science. Welcome to the curious world of medieval medicine. Now, before your imagination runs wild with images of leeches, bloodletting, and chanting monks, well, actually, keep those in mind. You wouldn't be wrong. But tonight, we won't linger on the horror. Instead, we'll ease into a quieter, more thoughtful exploration. One that asks a very gentle question. Could some of these strange medieval treatments have actually worked? And the answer whispered softly across centuries is, yes, some did. Quite a few. In fact, let's begin at the beginning. Imagine a stone cottage nestled at the edge of a small medieval village. The thatched roof leaks just a little. The walls are thick with lime and straw, and the smell inside is a mix of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something less pleasant like damp wool and the vague sourness of time. There's no doctor here, not in the modern sense, but there is a woman, older, with hands rough from grinding and gathering, who knows what to do when someone coughs up blood or burns a hand on the hearth. She doesn't read Latin. She doesn't wear a white coat, but she has a pouch of dried lavender, a pot of lard with marigold stirred in, and a small piece of moldy bread tucked away in a cloth for when things get serious, and when the coughing gets worse, or a wound won't stop weeping. She brings out that bread not to eat, of course, but to press against the wound. Strange. Yes, but effective. Surprisingly, yes, because unknown to her, the green fuzz growing across the old loaf is doing something remarkable. It's killing bacteria. Hundreds of years before Alexander Fleming noticed a moldy petri dish and discovered penicillin, medieval folk healers were unknowingly applying nature's own antibiotic. It wasn't exact science, not by a long shot, but it worked often enough that the knowledge lingered. This was the nature of medicine in the Middle Ages. It was practical, passed down through memory and mistakes. It was intuitive. Sometimes based on the stars, sometimes on saints, sometimes on symptoms, and always surrounded by the reality of death being very close and healing being a hopeful act. There were two worlds of medicine in medieval Europe. One filled with robed monks, dusty tomes, and treatments dictated by Galenic theory based on balancing bodily humors, blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm, and another, more hidden, one found in kitchens and forests, where women stirred nettle into broths and watched the moon before harvesting certain herbs. The first world was about learning, the second, about living. None of this was uniform. Of course, medicine varied wildly across Europe, from the snowy highlands of Scotland to the humid plains of Italy. A peasant in Normandy had different remedies than a merchant in Prague, but they all shared one truth. Illness was a fact of life, and treating it, in whatever way one could, was as essential as planting seeds or spinning wool. Close your eyes, if you like, Imagine you've just fallen ill in the year 1284. Your body aches, your head is heavy, and your skin feels flushed and raw. There's no hospital in your village. The priest may offer a blessing, but not a remedy. The local healer wraps you in blankets, places a small bowl of wine beside you not to drink, but to wash your wounds. Perhaps she adds a pinch of rosemary. She doesn't explain why, she just does it. Then she brings a piece of old bread, green with mold. She tears it in half, dips it in warm water, and presses it to your arm where a wound has begun to fester. Now, don't mistake this for a miracle. Medieval medicine was full of things that didn't work. Astrology dictated treatments. Mercury was sometimes given for headaches. Boiled toad was a cure for gout. But within the confusion, within the superstition, were seeds of truth. Honey really did prevent infection. Lavender really did calm the nerves. And yes, the mold on bread contained the same penicillin-producing fungi we use today. This, then, is the central paradox of medieval medicine. It was both deeply flawed and unexpectedly effective, and tonight, over the chapters to come, we'll explore that contradiction not with ridicule or shock, but with respect. Because in a world without vaccines or painkillers, every healing moment was a triumph of observation, patience, and hope. So rest easy now. The night is long, and there are many stories ahead. We'll visit monasteries where monks raised leeches and ground herbs by candlelight. We'll walk into the chambers of midwives who used warm oil and whispered words to ease childbirth. We'll explore the crowded, noisy streets where barbers did more than cut a hair, they pulled teeth, drained boils, and stitched wounds with hands that moved quickly but not always kindly. And we'll learn, too, how deeply healing was tied to the divine, how prayers were muttered as poultices were applied, how relics were believed to carry healing powers, how the sacred and the physical were never truly separate in the medieval mind. To heal the body was also to soothe the soul, because that's what healing meant back then. It wasn't a guarantee. It was a chance, a hope, a prayer wrapped in cloth and steeped in sage. As you drift, know that the world you're visiting was real. These were real people, real parents trying to save their children, real soldiers hoping to stop a wound from rotting, real women risking their lives in childbirth. And behind every strange treatment was a very human desire to live, to ease suffering, to care for each other in the only ways they knew how. Strange, yes, surprising, certainly, but sometimes it worked. And isn't that, in the end, what we all want? Something to ease the pain, something to believe in, something that works, however oddly. And so, the thread of healing winds onward away from the mold-flecked loaf pressed to a wound, and deeper into the body itself, to a time when illness wasn't just a matter of pain or fever, but imbalance. In the minds of medieval physicians, your body was a delicate vessel, not only of flesh and bone, but of forces for elemental fluids, or humours, that ruled your health, your emotions, your personality, and even your fate. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, these weren't mere metaphors, were believed to be the literal ingredients of your body's essence. When all four were in harmony, you were well. When one outweighed the others, you might find yourself feverish, melancholic, sluggish, or quick to anger. This wasn't just medicine, it was cosmology. These humours were tied to the stars, to the seasons, to the time of day, They echoed in the rustle of wind, the turning of leaves, and the waxing of the moon. So what did a doctor do when your balance slipped? He bled you. Bloodletting, the grand, gruesome cornerstone of medieval medicine, was practiced across Europe and the Islamic world for centuries. And as strange as it sounds, it was built on a logic that, in its own way, made sense if there was too much of one humor, especially blood. Why not let some of it out? Picture this. You're lying on a straw-stuffed mattress in a chilly room. A trained physician, or, more often, a barber surgeon, wraps a leather strap around your arm. He says little. He's done this many times before. With a practiced motion, he takes a small, curved blade, or perhaps a lancet, and makes a swift cut in your vein. A bowl sits ready to catch the flow, sometimes inscribed with symbols of the zodiac to mark the occasion. It might sound frightening, and in truth, it sometimes was, but many believed it brought relief, a lightness of body, a clearing of the mind. And in a time when fevers raged, headaches throbbed, and infection spread with no known cause, the controlled release of blood seemed like something tangible, something you could do, a step toward balance. But bleeding didn't always mean cutting. Enter the leech. Ah, yes, the humble, slippery, black-bellied creature whose name still evokes discomfort centuries later. Leeches were harvested from ponds and marshes, kept in damp cloth or glass jars, and applied to the skin where blood pooled near the surface, most often on the arms, legs, temples, or even behind the ears. Once placed, the leech attached itself with an eager mouth and began to feed. Their saliva, rich in anticoagulants, kept blood flowing freely, allowing them to feast for 20 minutes or more. When swollen and heavy, they dropped off on their own drunk, in a way, on the life within. Surprisingly, this practice wasn't always barbaric. In fact, leech therapy has made a quiet return in modern microsurgery. The anticoagulants and enzymes secreted by leeches can promote blood flow and tissue healing, especially in delicate operations involving fingers or skin grafts. And so, while their use in the Middle Ages was based more on humor theory than science, the creatures themselves possessed properties that genuinely aided in healing. Still, the goals of medieval bleeding weren't always practical. Sometimes, bloodletting was timed not to the symptoms of the patient, but to the stars. Astrological charts dictated which days were safest or most effective for letting blood. Certain body parts were connected to constellations, and each month had a different prescription for where and how to bleed. A common calendar known as a zodiac man was used for this purpose, a painted or inked image of a human figure overlaid with zodiac signs, mapping astrological influence from head to toe. A physician consulting such a chart might determine that bleeding from the left arm on a Thursday in March, while the moon was in Virgo, could treat a liver ailment. It sounds fanciful to us now, but to them, it was order. It was harmony with the universe. Of course, results varied wildly. Many patients recovered, or seemed to, and credited the process. Others grew weak, or even died from excessive bleeding, especially when leeches or blades were applied too liberally. But remember, there were few alternatives. In a world without antibiotics, without sterile instruments, without anesthesia, sometimes you did what you could, or what you'd seen work before. And bleeding had symbolic power to. In a deeply Christian culture, the shedding of blood resonated with the passion of Christ, with the sacrifice of saints, with purification itself. To bleed was not only to balance the body, it was to cleanse it, to drain it of sin, of corruption, of invisible malice. Not every ailment called for blood. For coughs and colds, herbal syrups were favored. For headaches, dried flowers and cold but for fever, inflammation, or anything thought to arise from an excess of hot, moist blood, a bowl and blade were often the first resort. Sometimes they even used bleeding prophylactically to prevent illness. If the seasons were changing, or if the city was rumored to be under threat of plague, people lined up to be bled. Better to restore balance now, they thought, than wait for it to unravel later. And in monasteries, where many of the early physicians were trained, scheduled bloodlettings were part of life. Monks would bleed each other at regular intervals throughout the year, both as a health ritual and as a way of imitating the suffering of Christ. Imagine a stone infirmary lined with wooden cots, quiet but for the rustle of robes and the occasional splash of liquid in a basin. A monk, pale and patient, sits with his arm extended, offering it not in fear, but in reverence. This was part of his discipline, his devotion, but not all bleeds were so formal. In the hands of barber surgeons, bloodletting was far more brisk. Barbershops, especially in bustling towns, doubled as emergency rooms. You could walk in for a haircut and leave with a freshly drained abscess or a few ounces of bloodlighter. The classic red and white barber pole. It still echoes this history. Red for blood, white for bandages, and the pole itself. Some say it mimicked the staff patients gripped to steady themselves during the process. The instruments used were simple but effective: fleams, lancets, scarificators, and cupping glasses. Scarificators, for example, were little brass boxes filled with spring-loaded blades that, with the push of a button, would release tiny incisions in the skin. Over these, a warm glass cup was placed, creating suction and drawing blood outward. The result looked dramatic: round, crimson welts rising on the skin, but was often praised for the relief it brought. We mustn't judge too harshly. These were efforts born of observation and tradition, not malice or ignorance. For some patients, the ritual of being bled or may have provided comfort in itself, a sense that something was being done. And sometimes, when symptoms were caused by real issues like high blood pressure or localized swelling, the temporary relief might have been genuine. The deeper truth is this: medicine in the Middle Ages wasn't static. It evolved. Physicians debated, experimented, wrote treatises, and corresponded across borders. Islamic scholars translated and expanded Greek knowledge. Jewish doctors brought traditions from and every now and then a new idea emerged cautiously, often skeptically, but it made its mark. So even within the ritual of bloodletting there was curiosity. What if we bled less? Or from different places? What if we didn't bleed at all? And gradually the grip of the humours began to loosen. But we're not there yet. In this chapter of history, balance was still the great goal, and blood vital, sacred, and symbolic was its measure. As the candle burns lower and the air grows still, let your thoughts drift not to the sting of the blade, but to the people behind the practice, to the mother who allowed her child to be bled in desperation, to the weary traveller who stopped at a market stall for leech treatment, to the quiet monk who offered his wrist in the name of health and holiness, all of them seeking healing, hoping, trusting, believing that perhaps, just perhaps, the answer to their suffering could be drawn out, drop by drop, and in the soft hush of this medieval night, we honor their hope, because sometimes even the oddest remedies carry within them a grain of truth and the pulse of a very human heart. Imagine, if you will, a grey morning mist hanging low over the fields of France or the rolling hills of England. The ground is churned with footprints and hooves, stained with both mud and blood. The clang of swords has quieted. The shouting has faded into groans and murmurs, and scattered across the torn earth lie men some breathing, some still, each one a silent story etched in flesh. In the wake of battle, medieval Europe did not possess ambulances, sterile gloves, or trauma centers. What they had instead were makeshift shelters, wooden stretchers hauled by fellow soldiers, and the sharp-eyed presence of the battlefield healer, whether a robed monk, a traveling barber surgeon, or a wise woman versed in herbs. These caregivers faced the impossible task of saving lives with little more than instinct, ritual, and what knowledge could be passed from hand to hand. The first moments after injury were the most critical. A knight with an arrow embedded in his thigh might have been dragged from the fray, moaning beneath the weight of his armor, while a foot soldier might be carried by comrades on a plank torn from a wagon. The goal was simple: get the wounded away from the chaos, away from the trampling feet and flying arrows, and into a place, any place that might resemble safety. Sometimes that safe place was nothing more than a tent draped with linen, flapping in the wind. Other times it was a monastery near the field, where the air smelled of incense and beeswax, and the chants of prayer were interrupted only by cries of pain. Inside these spaces, the work began quietly, swiftly, and with grim familiarity. The medieval healer's kit was basic yet brutal. A curved iron blade, blackened from repeated firings, might be used to open a wound. A cautery rod, essentially a searing hot piece of iron, might be pressed to a bleeding artery to stop the flow. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic. The sharp sting of alcohol was rare, and often replaced with wine, vinegar, or a whispered prayer for those lucky or unlucky enough to stay conscious. The sounds were unforgettable. The hiss of fire heating metal, the wet rip of fabric torn from skin, the grunt of pain held between clenched teeth, and yet these healers persisted, doing their best to stitch flesh, drain pus, or bind bone with what linen or wool they had. Many treatments depended on the type of wound. Arrow wounds were common, and their removal was risky. The healer might use forceps or fingers to extract the shaft, being careful not to push it deeper. Some arrows had barb screw hooks, designed to shred muscle when pulled. These sometimes had to be pushed clean through before being snapped and removed. Every such act brought agony, and often infection. Swords delivered ghastly slices, but they were oddly cleaner, in some ways less likely to carry the dirt and splinters that arrows or maces did. Still, they tore through veins and tendons. A man sliced at the shoulder might lose the use of an arm forever, even if he survived. Ligatures to tie off vessels were rudimentary, often just twisted strips of cloth. Infection, again, hovered nearby like a waiting ghost. Blunt force trauma was another beast entirely. Soldiers struck with maces, clubs, or falling debris might suffer shattered ribs, concussions, or ruptured organs, injuries that looked mild on the outside, but brought death in the quiet hours after the battle. For these, the healer could do little. Some poultices might be applied brews of herbs, like comfrey, poppy, or yarrow, but they could not mend what was torn inside. There were efforts, of course, to understand and organize. Some battlefield surgeons came equipped with handbooks, often Latin translations of older Greek or Arabic medical texts. These might include diagrams of the human body, lists of treatments for various injuries, or herbal recipes for pain relief. But access to such texts was limited, and literacy among healers was rare. Much of what they knew came from apprenticeship, intuition, and experience, earned at great cost. One method of treatment surprisingly advanced for its time was the use of antiseptic substances, though not by modern standards. Vinegar was a favorite, believed to clean wounds and prevent corruption. Honey, too, was sometimes smeared on open gashes. Its natural antimicrobial properties, unbeknownst to those who used it, yet effective all the same. And then there were the charms, the whispered incantations, the little leather pouches hung around the neck, filled with herbs, coins, or bits of bone. For many, healing was not only physical, but spiritual. A battlefield injury might be seen as punishment for sin, or a test from God. Thus, a healer's words held as much weight as their touch. Psalms were recited as salves were spread. Crosses were drawn in air over wounded skin. The monks who treated the wounded in monasteries saw their labor as holy work. They believed the suffering they witnessed brought them closer to Christ, who himself bore wounds for mankind. And so, even as they stitched and bandaged, they prayed soft murmurs that mixed with the cries of the wounded in an eerie harmony of pain and hope. Recovery was slow and often incomplete. A wound could fester for weeks. Amputations were sometimes necessary, especially for gangrenous limbs, though the process was brutal. A man might be strapped down with rope, a cup of strong ale his only comfort, while the surgeon worked with a saw or heated blade. Infection was a likely outcome, but some survived missing a leg, perhaps, but alive. Those who did survive bore their scars with pride or shame. A knight with a missing eye might claim honor. A peasant with a twisted limb might be pitied or feared. Some wounds brought madness, especially head injuries. There are records of men who spoke strangely after battle, who lost memories, or who wept uncontrollably. Today, we would speak of trauma, of PTSD. Then, it was seen as spiritual affliction. Pain relief was limited. Herbal tinctures were the most common solution. Poppy syrup, if available, could dull pain and induce sleep. Valerian root might be used to calm tremors. Mandrake, henbane, and other powerful herbs were used cautiously. They brought dreams, sometimes death. The line between healing and poisoning was raised. And yet, in all this, there was innovation. The battlefield was a teacher. Techniques developed there often spread to towns and cities. Cauterization became standard practice. The idea of triage, prioritizing the most urgent wounds, emerged from necessity. Even record-keeping improved as some healers began to document cases and outcomes. There were also women healers, midwives, and herbalists, who brought different knowledge to the table. Though they were often excluded from formal battlefield care, some followed the armies or tended to local wounded. Their remedies, passed down through generations, included treatments for inflammation, fever, and swelling, things that could mean the difference between life and death. Over time, as battles continued, some cities established more organized medical services. Surgeons began to travel with armies. Supply carts were stocked with linen, tools, and remedies. Kings and nobles began to recognize the value of medical preparedness. Still, these were small steps in a world where war remained brutal and healing remained uncertain. In the quieter hours after battle, the wounded lay on pallets of straw, covered with thin blankets. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, rot, and sage. A healer might move from one to the next, checking dressings, murmuring encouragement. Outside, crows circled. Inside, hope flickered, faint but not gone. Even in this grim environment, compassion bloomed, soldiers wept for friends. Healers held the hands of dying men. Sometimes songs were sung not of victory, but of peace. A lullaby hummed by a nurse, a prayer whispered by a monk. In these moments, the harshness of medieval life softened, revealing the enduring thread of human tenderness. And so, while the swords and arrows took much, they could not erase that small, stubborn grace, the willingness to mend, to comfort, to try. Even in the darkest hours of medieval warfare, there were those who reached not for the sword, but for the who chose not to take life, but to preserve it. As the torchlight flickered low across the stone walls of a rural chapel, somewhere in the heart of a quiet medieval valley, another form of medicine was taking shape, one that did not require sharp iron or pungent herbs. It did not sting like vinegar in an open wound, nor did it rely on the uncertain chemistry of folk remedies. Instead, it required only the trembling touch of a hand, the soft murmur of faith, and the belief that healing could come from forces unseen. This was the age when medicine met mysticism, and the healing power of touch and prayer became its own kind of sacred intervention. In those days, medicine was as much a spiritual act as a physical one. Illness was rarely viewed as purely biological. It was often interpreted as divine punishment, a sign of imbalance, or the whisper of demonic presence in the body. When one became sick, particularly in the countryside or among the devout, they would not only seek a poultice or potion, but a priest, a relic, or even a whispered prayer said over the wound. Healing, in this world, was not just about curing the body, it was about saving the soul, at least calming it. It is hard, perhaps, for the modern mind to fully grasp this intermingling of medicine and miracle. Today, we separate our physicians from our priests, our antibiotics from our amen. But in the medieval world, these things overlapped with comforting ease. In a single visit, a person might receive a blend of treatments: a compress of chamomile to ease a swollen joint, a blessing to ward off evil spirits, and perhaps the gentle laying on of hands by a holy person believed to possess divine gifts. All three were considered essential ingredients in the journey back to health. Among the most revered of these touch healers were the saints, or more precisely, those thought to channel their power. Certain saints were believed to specialize in specific ailments: Saint Blaise for sore throats, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Dymphna for madness. Stories abounded of pilgrims making long and painful journeys to shrines where a saint's relic, often a bone fragment or a scrap of cloth, was housed. There they would pray, touch the sacred item, and hope for healing. And whether through placebo, divine intervention, or sheer desperation, many swore the pain subsided. In monasteries, touch-based healing was more formalized. Monks who were trained in basic medicine often used gentle massage, pressure, and what we might now call therapeutic touch. They had learned from ancient texts, Roman and Greek volumes preserved in scriptoriums, that touch could stimulate blood flow, ease tension, and promote the body's natural balances. When combined with prayer, this physical care became a deeply spiritual act, a merging of body and soul in search of relief. There were also local healers, sometimes women, who practiced what they called hands-on healing. They had no official blessing from the church, and in fact, some were later accused of witchcraft. But in many towns and villages, they were respected and even cherished. Their rituals varied. They might trace symbols over the skin, whisper in, or simply press their hands over the heart or the forehead and breathe quietly. Mothers used such methods on feverish children. Lovers held hands with the dying, Elders touched their own scars as they prayed for strength. Touch, in all its forms, was sacred. Of course, not all prayers and touches were welcomed. In darker moments of history, when fear overtook reason, some saw illness as proof of demonic possession. In such cases, the laying on of hands became more aggressive. Exorcisms, often violent, were carried out on those who were epileptic, delusional, or simply misunderstood. The Church's attempts to heal the soul sometimes harmed the body. Still, even in these frightening rituals, the belief remained the same, that through prayer and proximity, healer, however painful, could come. The kings and queens of medieval Europe also engaged in healing through touch, though theirs was more ceremonial. The royal touch, as it came to be known, was a public spectacle. Monarchs believed to be divinely appointed would line up afflicted subjects, usually those suffering from scrofula, a form of tuberculosis, and lay hands on them in the hope of curing the disease. These ceremonies were often followed by feasts or coins pressed into the patient's palms. Whether they were healed or not, they had received the blessing of a king, and that, in its own way, was considered a miracle. Inside the sick rooms of the poor, healing by touch was a humbler affair. A grandmother's hand on a feverish brow, a father cradling his wounded son, a midwife steadying a woman in childbirth. These small gestures, quiet and instinctive, formed the invisible scaffolding of care in everyday medieval life. They were rarely recorded in texts or illuminated in manuscripts, but they carried weight and meaning. Touch, after all, is one of the oldest medicines. It is as old as the human need for comfort. In a world where plagues swept through towns without warning, where childbirth could mean death, where injuries festered and illnesses lingered, the simple presence of another's hand could mean everything. It was a way of saying, "I am here, you are not alone. Even if we cannot cure this, we will endure it together." But prayer, too, was its own kind of salve. The rhythmic repetition of the Psalms, the soft murmur of Hail Marys, the ringing of bells calling the faithful to communal worship. In those moments, belief itself became part of the healing. Many found peace in the idea that suffering had meaning, that it could be offered up to God, that it mirrored the passion of Christ, or that it was a test of faith. Illness, then, was not always a punishment. Sometimes it was a pilgrimage of the body, one that would end either in healing or in heavenly reward. In village chapels, votive candles glowed with quiet intensity, each one lit for a sick child, an aging parent, a neighbor struck by fever. The flame became a silent prayer, dancing upward toward heaven. And in monasteries, monks would copy herbal recipes by day and offer prayers for the sick by night, their voices echoing through cold stone halls. These chants, called plainsong, had a slow flowing rhythm designed to lull the soul toward peace. For the listener in bed, unsure if dawn would ever come, the sound must have felt like hope itself. At times, the two worlds of healing physical and spiritual met in profound ways. A leper, shunned by most, might be touched only by a priest administering last rites. That one touch, that act of holy compassion, might be the first in years. For that soul, it mattered more than any tincture. It was proof they were still human, still worthy of grace. Even medical manuals of the time, like the written by female physicians in Salerno, combined empirical observation with moral guidance. They advised on how to treat wounds and ease childbirth, but also warned that sin could block healing. Thus, confession became part of the cure. A clean soul could lead to a healed body. or so many believed. And while science would one day separate itself from spirit, in the Middle Ages they were partners. The healer was also a believer. The patient, often kneeling in prayer, was both hopeful and resigned. Death was near. Always. But so was mercy. As you listen now, nestled in your own quiet space, think of those ancient rooms filled with candlelight and whispered chants. Picture the tired hands of a monk pressed gently to a child's chest, the murmured prayer that followed. Imagine the trembling fingers of a wife tracing the edge of her husband's wound, both praying he would live. These moments, quiet and small, were the real miracles, not found in relics or royal touch, but in the simple act of human compassion. The healing power of touch and prayer may not have cured every wound, but it softened pain, eased loneliness, and brought comfort in a world of uncertainty. And in many ways, isn't that still what we seek? Now, let your mind rest in that candlelit room. Let the chants fade to silence. Let the healing hands slip away like a dream. The flicker of torchlight might still warm the stone walls of the monastery from our last chapter. But now we turn toward something more invisible, more internal. A form of illness that couldn't be seen or bandaged or bled with leeches. We step gently now into the quiet shadowlands of the medieval mind, into the sorrowed corners of the human madness, and the strange and fascinating ways medieval people tried to understand what we now call mental health. They didn't have psychologists. There were no diagnoses, no prescriptions to stabilize moods, no therapy couches to recline upon, but there were monks with kind eyes, herbalists with quiet hands, and a persistent, if patchy, curiosity about the mysterious ways of the mind and soul. Mental illness, or, as it was often framed, then affliction of the spirit or imbalance of the humors, was part of life's great puzzle. You see, to medieval Europeans, suffering wasn't just physical or emotional, it was moral, cosmic, even. It might be a sign of divine displeasure, a consequence of sin, or it might be strangely and tenderly a mark of spiritual closeness to God. So when someone began to weep without reason, or wander distractedly through fields, mumbling to themselves, the reaction wasn't always fear or scorn. Sometimes it was reverence, sometimes pity, sometimes superstition. Let's start with the dominant lens of the time, the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These weren't just biological fluids. They were the essence of personality, health, sanity. A cheerful person was full of blood, they said. A sluggish, calm one had an excess of phlegm. Too much yellow bile brought anger. And black bile, that was the root of melancholy. A brooding, poetic sadness, a kind of thoughtful darkness that, when left unchecked, could curdle into madness. Melancholy wasn't always seen as dangerous. Sometimes it was even admired. Monks who contemplated the divine for long hours were often described as melancholy. Artists, poets, even certain saints. But if it crossed a threshold, if that mood deepened into silence, paranoia, or delusions, then it was a problem to be solved. And the solutions? Oh, they were strange, tender, sometimes cruel, but always fascinating. Take, for instance, the treatment of solitary sadness. A nobleman overcome by grief might be sent to a garden, not just for leisure, but as therapy. Medieval herbalists and clerics believed that fresh air and blooming flowers helped rebalance the melancholic soul. He might be encouraged to take gentle walks among rosemary and sage, to sip a broth of warm nettle, or to sit near a stream and simply listen. Music, too, was medicine. The gentle strumming of a lute, a soft windpipe melody. In some medieval hospitals, music was played at dusk, not just for comfort, but because it was believed to align the rhythm of the heart with the harmony of the spheres. And there was always the bath. For the melancholic, warm water was more than hygiene. It was transformation. One particularly beautiful remedy found in 13th century texts prescribes bathing the afflicted in warm water steeped with rose petals, then rubbing the skin gently with oils infused with lavender or mud. The scent was believed to soothe the nerves, the Tatar reintroduction to the self. But what if the sadness was deeper? What if it became erratic or frightening? Then the treatments turned more dramatic. A person might be bled not from the head, but from the ankle or inner arm. The idea was that the black bile causing the sadness had pooled in the body and must be drawn out. Sometimes the head was shaved, not out of cruelty, but out of medical belief. The scalp, it was thought, could overheat and trap unhealthy vapors. A cool breeze on bare skin, combined with ointments of vinegar and herbs, was meant to release the pressure, and sometimes more forceful methods were used. There were reports rare, but real of melancholic patients being startled out of their stupor with sudden noises, bells, whistles, or, in darker cases, even physical punishment. It was cruel, yes, but it came not always from malice. Sometimes it came from desperation. In monasteries, the treatments were gentler. A monk who began to withdraw, who stopped attending prayers, or ate a little, might be assigned a spiritual companion, someone to walk with him, eat beside him, offer scripture, conversation, gentle companionship. And for women, their treatment of melancholy was deeply entwined with their social role. A woman who cried too much, or spoke with wild eyes, might be called hysterical, a term whose roots, sadly, lie in the word for womb. It was believed that the womb could travel inside the body, causing madness. The cure, fumigation, aromatic smoke blown beneath the skirts, frightening, even humiliating. But others were simply told to rest, to be massaged with calming oils, to wear amulets that warded off bad spirits. You see, some people believed that madness came not from the body at all but from spirits, demons, or divine punishment. A person who saw visions might be thought to be possessed, or depending on the vision a prophet. Exorcisms were rare but real. A person suffering from hallucinations might be tied down, sprinkled with holy water, and prayed over with deep urgency. But in other towns, the same person might be taken in, gently, protected, cared for. The line between madness and holiness was very thin. One tale tells of a woman named Alred, who wept every night, whispering of angels and demons. Some said she was touched by God. Others feared she was mad. The local priest allowed her to live in a small room beside the church, feeding her through a grate, where she sang quietly for hours each day. Was she mentally ill? Spiritually gifted? Both? No one knows. Then there were the lonely, troubled souls who roamed village to village, mumbling, sometimes shouting, often avoided, but in many places they were fed. Given a coin, called fools of God. There was a kind of sacredness in their madness, a belief that they suffered not just for themselves, but for all of us. And so, as we drift along this quiet current of history, we find that mental illness in the Middle Ages was neither fully understood nor entirely ignored. It was misdiagnosed, yes, often mistreated. but it was also seen, felt, named in strange and beautiful ways. There were songs for sadness, herbs for grief, warm beds for troubled minds. Not everywhere, not always, but often enough to remind us that medieval people, despite all their darkness, had light in them too. And maybe that's the strangest thing of all, that within a time we think of as superstitious and severe, there were moments of tenderness, of hope, of healing. Even if their methods make us raise an eyebrow today, we can still sense the heart behind them. A heart that saw suffering and said, "Let me help." A heart that believed, even in the deepest shadows of the mind, there might still be light. There is something quietly powerful about a hand. The way it can rest gently on a shoulder, cradle a cheek, or clasp another in comfort. In the Middle Ages, when science was sparse and suffering was everywhere, that simple human gesture on immense and sometimes miraculous significance. While today we speak of hospitals and prescriptions, 1,000 years ago people placed their faith in warm hands, sacred prayers, and the invisible power believed to flow between bodies. Imagine, if you will, a cold stone chamber in a monastery tucked into the green folds of a European valley. The air is still, but for the rustle of robes and the soft murmur of Latin chants. A young boy, pale and weak from fever, lies on a straw-stuffed mattress. His mother clutches her hands tightly, whispering words not meant for anyone but the heavens. And then, slowly, a monk kneels beside the boy, dipping his fingers into a bowl of oil infused with herbs. He presses them to the child's forehead, murmuring a prayer as his hand traces the sign of the cross. It isn't medicine, not in the way we know it, but it is hope, it is comfort, and to those watching, it is healing. In medieval Europe, healing was more than physical, it was spiritual. The body was not seen as separate from the soul, and illness was rarely just about infection or injury. It was, quite often, a sign, a message from God, a test, a punishment, or even a mysterious blessing in disguise. So to be healed, to truly recover, required more than herbs or rest. It required grace. And one of the most common ways grace was believed to be transmitted was through touch. The laying on of hands was an ancient ritual long before Christianity took root. But the medieval church embraced it with particular fervor. Priests, bishops, monks, and even kings were all said to possess, at times, the ability to heal with their hands. It was not magic, it was divine intervention, a sacred act that channeled heavenly power through earthly flesh. To be touched by a holy person was to be touched, in a way, by God himself. And so, across villages and towns, in castles and cloisters, people gathered in hopes of that sacred connection. Pilgrims travelled long distances to reach the tombs of saints whose bones or garments were believed to retain curative properties. They would kneel beside the reliquary, pressing their foreheads against stone, whispering prayers, and sometimes even sleeping beside the sacred remains, hoping that the nearness of sanctity would ease their ailments. This act, known as incubation, was common, and those who awoke cured were not just healed, they were blessed. But not all touch came from saints or shrines. Sometimes it came from the hands of monarchs. In France and England especially, the royal touch was a widespread belief that kings, by divine right and coronation, had been gifted the power to cure scrofula, also known as the king's evil. This disfiguring disease, a form of tuberculosis, caused swelling in the neck and lymph nodes. And so, subjects would line up in courtyards and churches, waiting for the sovereign to lay hands on them. It was as much a ceremony as a treatment. The king would touch each sufferer, say a short prayer, and present them with a coin or token, an object now believed to carry healing power of its own. Did it work? By modern standards, perhaps not always, but to those who received it, the act of being seen, touched, and blessed by a king was a moment of profound importance. It gave them dignity. It gave them hope. And in an age where even small hopes could be lifelines, that was no small medicine. In monasteries, monks and nuns provided what care they could. Their tools were simple: warm compresses, herbal infusions, and hands steeped in devotion. They practiced the laying on of hands not with fanfare, but with humility. For them, healing was a form of service. To touch the sick was to embrace the suffering of Christ himself. There are quiet, beautiful entries in abbey ledgers describing how monks would anoint the sick with oil, press their hands over wounds, and offer whispered prayers in the dark of night. These were not physicians, not always, but they were caregivers, and their touch tender, steady, familiarly offered more than most medicines of the time ever could. Even today, we understand the power of touch in ways medieval people intuited long ago. The warmth of a hand on your back, the security of someone holding your arm when you're in pain, the comfort of being seen, held, and cared for. These things, timeless and universal, were central to the way people understood healing. Outside of the church and royal courts, there were other hands at work. Midwives, wise women, and village healers practiced their own forms of tactile healing. They would rub bruised limbs with salves made from comfrey and fennel. They would gently massage the bellies of laboring women or trace healing charms along a child's spine. Sometimes they used rituals, drawing signs on the skin, speaking old words passed down through generations, or tying cords around wrists and ankles. This blend of folklore, touch, and belief formed the core of peasant medicine, and while the church often condemned these practices, branding them as superstitions or even witchcraft, many people trusted these local healers more than distant clerics or arrogant physicians, because they lived among them. They knew their names, and their hands, roughened by years of work, still knew how to soothe a burn or cradle a dying man's hand in his final hour. Touch was not always curative in the sense we think of now, but it was deeply therapeutic. For people who lived in constant uncertainty in an age of plague, famine, and war, the simple act of being touched, of not being alone in pain, was invaluable. In many ways, it still is. Studies today show that touch can reduce anxiety, lower heart rates, and even ease physical pain. And while medieval people didn't have data, they had experience. They knew, instinctively, that comfort and contact were vital parts of healing. Religious rituals also relied on the symbolism and power of touch. Anointing the sick, particularly before death, was a central part of Christian care. The priest would dip his thumb into sacred oil and draw crosses upon the forehead, chest, hands, and feet. This wasn't just for healing. It was for preparation, for peace, for grace in death. The final moments of a life were wrapped in layers of touch, hands clasped in prayer, foreheads kissed in farewell, bodies washed and wrapped by loved ones who whispered blessings as they worked. In this, too, there was healing not of the body, but of the heart. Families found comfort in these actions. Grief found structure. And the dying, if they were aware, might pass, knowing they were not alone. That is a kind of medicine. There were also dark sides to this culture of touch. Accusations of improper healing, of deceit or heresy, could ruin a healer's life. Women, especially midwives or herbalists, were vulnerable. A healing that went wrong, a fever that worsened, or simply the jealousy of a neighbor could turn helpful hands into suspect ones. Still, many continued their work, knowing that their skills were needed. Their touch might not have been sanctioned by the church, but for many it was sacred nonetheless. Even traveling charlatans, who offered cures from wagons and market stalls, relied on the ritual of touch. They would tap a shoulder, press a coin into a palm, or grasp a wrist in mock examinational to establish trust, to create the illusion of care. And sometimes, just sometimes, their powders and potions worked, if not through science, then through belief, through the comforting illusion that someone, somewhere, had a cure just for you. We tend to think of medieval medicine as primitive, but in its reverence for human connection, it was profound. It understood something modern medicine can sometimes forget, that healing is not only about fixing what is broken, it's about reminding the ill that they are seen, that their pain matters, that they are not alone. And so, in abbeys and huts, in great halls and market squares, people reached for each other. Hands passed over foreheads, rubbed shoulders, held trembling fingers. Mothers soothed their children. Friends comforted the wounded. Healers, true or false, laid their palms upon strangers with sincerity. This was medieval medicine at its most intimate, not in the pages of dusty manuscripts, but in the warmth of one body meeting another. A hand in the darkness, a whisper over a wound, a prayer traced in oil. This was touch. This was healing. Let us now drift from the hot embers of cauterization and the cool iron tools of barber surgeons into the quieter, fragrant world of medieval herbs. For while some medieval cures called for bloodletting, boiling oils, or burnt toads, others found their roots in the green world that still grows softly around us. The hedgerows, the gardens, the forest edges, and the apothecaries' shelves. In this chapter, we turn our attention to herbal wisdom, not always strange, but often startling in its effectiveness, and so deeply woven into the rhythms of medieval life that it was difficult to say where faith ended and nature began. The humbler healers of the time, herbwives, wise women, and monks with ink-stained fingers relied not on steel, but on leaves, petals, roots, and bark. These were the medicines that whispered, not shouted, remedies that came not from pain, but from the subtle pull of nature. And though some herbs were steeped in superstition, many actually worked. Even today, modern pharmacology tips its hat to some of their uses. Let your mind wander to a stone-walled garden, perhaps enclosed by the walls of a monastery. The air is still, thick with the scent of rosemary and sage. A hooded figure moves slowly among the rows, collecting leaves with practiced hands. Each plant here is known by name, not just its Latin title, but the stories that follow it, what it cures, how it tastes, who it helped. The garden is quiet, but it holds centuries of accumulated healing knowledge. Some of it wrong, yes, but some of it remarkably right. Take lavender, for instance. In our own day, it's become a familiar scent tucked into soaps, candles, and teas. But in medieval Europe, it was believed to calm the spirit, ease sleep, and even guard against plague. Physicians carried nosegays of lavender and other fragrant herbs, holding them to their faces to avoid miasmas, the bad air they thought carried disease. And while that belief may have missed the microbial mark, lavender's calming properties were very real. Studies today show its potential to reduce anxiety and improve sleep. The monks may not have known about neurotransmitters, but they knew something worked. Or consider willow bark, an unassuming remedy that medieval people chewed to ease pain and reduce fevers. What they didn't know, and what would only be discovered centuries later, is that willow bark contains salicin, the chemical precursor to modern aspirin. Yes, that little strip of bark, stripped and brewed into tea, carried within it the roots of one of the most widely used painkillers in the world. It's humbling to think that someone in a woolen cloak and muddy boots, gathering branches in the rain, stumbled upon a compound still used today. The use of herbs was not merely the province of the poor or the desperate. Even kings had their herb gardens, and within many monasteries, Herbal's illuminated texts cataloguing plants and their uses were among the most treasured volumes. These weren't just books. They were repositories of hope, scribbled with notes, marked with wax stains and pressed petals, passed down from one healer to the next. Chamomile was another favorite, brewed for stomach troubles or steeped in a hot bath to soothe aching muscles. Yarrow stopped bleeding. Comfrey helped broken bones heal. Horehound soothed coughs. And garlic pungent and shop was used for everything from warding off evil spirits to reducing inflammation. The line between medicine and magic was thin, often blurred by faith and folklore. Some herbs were tied to saints' days or collected only under moonlight. A sprig of rue might be tucked into a girl's bodice, not just to protect her from illness, but to guard her virtue. Nettles, stinging and aggressive, were sometimes whipped against sore joints, a treatment that may sound absurd, but one that introduced histamines and brought blood flow to inflamed areas, not unlike some modern therapies. And then there was St. John's wort, yellow and sunny, gathered at midsummer and believed to banish melancholy. It still finds use today for mild depression, a rare survivor of medieval healing that has maintained its place even in our skeptical age. One cannot speak of herbs without returning to the monks, the keepers of so much of this quiet knowledge. The Benedictine rule encouraged the care of the sick, and so many abbeys kept infirmaries within their walls. Monks grew gardens, not of beauty, but of use. They distilled tinctures, ground roots, and recorded their findings. And while some of their cures seem fanciful today, leeches, relics, the ashes of a martyr's robe, others were deeply pragmatic. It was in these sacred spaces that the art of healing met the discipline of observation, trial and error, passed down in ink and prayer. And though we often credit the Renaissance with the rebirth of science, much of its groundwork was laid in these quiet cloisters, among mortar and pestle, between psalms and poultices. But not all herbal knowledge lived in monasteries. Much of it belonged to women passed from mother to daughter in cottages and kitchens, at village edges, or behind hedgerows. These women, sometimes called cunning folk or wise women, knew how to ease a birth, mend a wound, or soothe a colicky baby. Their knowledge was often viewed with suspicion by church and crown alike, especially during the feverish centuries of witch hunting. And yet, many of these herbalists held the true keys to health in a world where licensed doctors were few and largely ineffective. In this green tradition, healing was not violent. It was coaxed, tea was brewed, oils were rubbed into skin, steam was inhaled, herbs were bundled, steeped, burned, or buried. There was a slowness to it, a patience that contrasts with modern medicine's quick fixes and sharp interventions. Healing took time, trust, and a deep respect for the land. To walk through a medieval market was to walk through a pharmacy. Stalls of dried flowers, bundles of sage and thyme, little vials of infused oil, sprigs of mint and rosemary hanging in fragrant clusters. There was no FDA, no standardized dosing, no child-proof caps, but there was, in its own way, a form of community medicine, shared understanding that some plants soothed and others harmed, and that wisdom lay in knowing the difference. And, of course, there were dangers. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, with its shiny blackberries and beautiful violet flowers, was sometimes used carefully for pain or as a sedative. But one misstep, one pinch too many, and it could stop the heart. Foxglove, now the source of digitalis for heart disease, was known to heal and to harm. The line between remedy and poison was razor thin, and every healer walked it with care, intuition, and often a bit of prayer. As we wander back from the herb garden to the larger halls of medicine, it's worth remembering that even today, nearly half of all pharmaceuticals have some origin in plants. Those monks and mothers weren't always wrong. In many cases, they were astonishingly right. They just didn't have the microscopes or the terminology. So, as you lie there, drifting in thought, imagine that you're walking barefoot through dew-soaked grass, a woven basket on your arm, the scent of crushed basil on your fingers, the sun warming your shoulders. You bend to gather calendula blooms, knowing they'll ease a rash. You pick peppermint for digestion. You hum an old tune as you work, not hurried, just part of a centuries-old rhythm of care and connection. Herbal medicine wasn't just about healing bodies. It was about honoring nature, recognizing the quiet power of the green world, and remembering that sometimes the softest remedies are the most enduring. And with that, we prepare to close this chapter of roots and petals, of bark and bomb. But we've not yet finished our journey. In the next part, we'll step into another corridor of medieval healing, one that may surprise you even more. Let your breath slow. Let the stories settle. Sleep, like lavender, comes gently. And now, from the green hush of herb gardens and monastery cloisters, we move to stranger pastures, into the barns, streams, and skies of the medieval animal kingdom. Because, for all their trust in plants, medieval healers and common folk alike held a surprisingly strong belief that animals, too, held healing powers, from the furred to the feathered, the slithering to the sacred. Creatures of all kinds found their way into cures, charms, and concoctions. It may seem odd now, even a bit unsettling, to imagine animals as medicine, but in medieval Europe, the natural world was interconnected in ways both practical and magical. Creatures were not just companions, tools, or food. They were potent, symbolic, sometimes holy, sometimes diabolical. And if God had placed them on earth, surely he had imbued some with the power to heal. Let's start with something familiar. Honey, not an animal itself, but a precious gift from bees who, in the medieval mind, were nearly sacred. Monasteries often kept hives, and honey was not just a sweetener but a medicine, an antiseptic, and a symbol of divine harmony. Applied to wounds, honey prevented infection and aided healing, something modern science has since confirmed. Thick and golden, it coated sore throats, soothed ulcers, and was mixed with herbs into syrups and salves. Beeswax, too, found its way into bombs, candles for prayer, and ointments meant to draw out infections. Then there was the use of animal fat, goose grease, lard, bear fat. These were not just cooking ingredients, but medicinal bases for salves and rubs. Warm goose fat, rubbed on the chest, was thought to ease coughs and bronchitis. Boiled with herbs, it became a liniment for sore joints or cold limbs. The fat was thought to carry the properties of whatever it touched, absorbing healing energy and delivering it into the body through the skin. Feathers were another common inclusion in medieval remedies. Owl feathers, in particular, held a strange allure. Our eyes, keen and ghostly, were thought to pierce the darkness, so it was believed that our feathers, or even dried eyes, ground into powder, might cure poor vision. Crow feathers, on the other hand, were tied more to death and decay, and sometimes used in darker folk charms meant to draw illness away from the body. almost like pulling poison into something already marked by shadow. We must now speak of toads and frogs, creatures both reviled and revered. They often appeared in medieval bestiaries as symbols of pestilence or evil, and yet, in practice, their bodies were believed to contain powerful properties. A dried toad, worn in a pouch around the neck, was thought to prevent nosebleeds. Ground into powder, the dried skin of a frog might be applied to boils or skin lesions. Some believed the toad absorbed disease, bloating as it took on the illness until it burst, freeing the sufferer. Odd, grotesque, but in its own way poetic. Snakes, too, slithered through medieval medicine. Their skins were dried and powdered, their fat used in ointments. Some believed a snake's skin could heal leprosy or reduce swelling. It wasn't just the animal's body that mattered, it was its symbolism. The snake, shedding its skin, represented rebirth and transformation, and so, its essence, however you extracted it, was seen as a way to coax renewal within the human body. The more exotic the creature, the more potent its imagined powers. Unicorn horn, or more accurately, the horn of a narwhal, passed off as one, was prized as a universal antidote. Ground into a fine powder and stirred into wine, it was said to neutralize poison. Kings and nobles would pay vast sums for a fragment of what they believed was a magical beast, convinced that just holding it could protect them from assassination or plague. Another odd favorite, beaver testicles. Yes, you heard that right. Castoreum, a substance derived from the castor sacs of beavers, was used as a cure for many things, from hysteria to headaches. Sometimes taken internally, sometimes burned and inhaled. It was pungent and strange. The logic, if we can call it that, was rooted in medieval humoral theory, the belief that bodily fluids governed health and behavior, and beaver products were thought to help balance certain hot or wet imbalances. Even birds had their medicinal uses beyond feathers. Swallow nests, when dissolved in liquid, were said to ease sore throats. The heart of a sparrow might be dried and carried for courage or brewed into an aphrodisiac tea. Pigeon droppings, when dried and powdered, were applied to skin conditions, or mixed into poultices for wounds. Disgusting by modern standards, but these remedies were believed to draw out infection through sympathetic magic. Using, like to treat like dogs, man's best friend, were sometimes sacrificed for medical purposes, particularly in folk cures for epilepsy. It was believed that transferring the seizure to the dog might spare the child. This tragic practice, thankfully, faded over time. But it's a somber reminder of how deepened at times misguided people's hope for healing could be. Let us not forget the leech, perhaps the most iconic of all medieval animal remedies. Kept in jars, raised in marshes, and sold by apothecaries, leeches were applied to the skin to remove bad blood. And while bloodletting was often excessive and based on flawed theories, the leech itself has proven useful. Its saliva contains anticoagulants and pain-numbing enzymes. Even today, leeches are used in microsurgery to help blood flow to delicate tissues. The medievals didn't know the science, but they knew the result. Then there were animal bones and skulls, ground into powders and mixed into wines or poultices. The bone of a stag might be carried for strength. The skull of a fox, when burned to ash, was used to treat toothaches or melancholy. Horn, hoof, and hide all were viewed not just as remnants, but as tools, conduits of some essence that could be borrowed, repurposed, rebalanced. The more fearsome the beast, the more powerful its presumed cure. Bear bile, boar's blood, the breath of a wolf. Each was collected, sometimes fictitiously, sometimes with brutal precision, and imbued with meaning. It wasn't just what the animal was, it was what it represented: strength, cunning, stealth, wildness. In a world full of disease, these were qualities worth bottling. We should also take a moment to reflect on the spiritual animals, the holy beasts. Lambs, so often associated with Christ, were not just symbolic. Their fat was used in ointments. Lamb's wool was wrapped around wounds, and lamb's blood was considered a purifying agent, especially when applied during religious festivals. Eggs from chickens or geese were used in countless cures, not just eaten, but applied directly to the body. A raw egg rubbed on a bruise. A boiled egg used to draw out fever. In some cases, eggs were broken into a bowl and read like tea leaves to diagnose ailments, a form of medieval divination blended with diagnosis. Milk, too, was both food and medicine. Human milk, in particular, was believed to have strong healing properties. A drop of breast milk placed in the eye was said to cure conjunctivitis. Cow's milk mixed with crushed herbs became a base for ointments, and goat's milk was preferred for those with fevers or wasting illnesses. Thinness believed to be gentler on fragile stomachs. And now, perhaps one of the strangest, the moss of a dead man's skull. This isn't quite an animal remedy, but it was believed that moss growing on a human skull, especially one buried in consecrated ground, had powerful healing properties. Mixed with animal fat or wine, it was used to treat epilepsy, nosebleeds, or even madness. Graveyard medicine, they called it, part science, part sorcery. Throughout these practices, what becomes clear is not just a belief in the curative power of animals, but a worldview in which everything, fur, fang, feather, and hoof, was interconnected. The suffering of one creature might ease the pain of another. There was a brutal tenderness to it, a desperate reverence. And within this logic, even the grotesque made sense. As you lie in quiet now, consider that strange world. A world where a child with a fever might be wrapped in lambskin, a warrior smeared with bear fat before battle, a mother lighting beeswax candles over her child's sickbed, whispering prayers while an owl's feather tucked into the rafters kept watch. A world where healing came not from laboratories, but from lakes and hedgerows, from feathers and claws, from wildness itself. The medieval age may have passed, but some of its wisdom lingers, its warnings, its wild guesses, and its echoes of intuition that sometimes, incredibly, proved true. Now, let your breath slow again. Let the creatures of old fade into memory. You've wandered through forest and farm, cathedral and cottage, and found healing not only in the strangest places, but in the soft heartbeat of history itself. And with that, we rest. One last chapter awaits us in the next section, a final whisper from the past, wrapping our journey in warmth and wonder. And now, with candlelight flickering low, we arrive at the final chapter of our strange and sleepy passage through the medieval world of healing. It's easy to dismiss the past, to look back at the practices we've explored together and raise an eyebrow. Or perhaps a quiet laugh. Leeching, bloodletting, drinking gold, wrapping wounds with moss from skulls. There's no denying that medieval medicine often strayed into the bizarre. But as the night deepens and our minds drift between past and present, let us consider not just the oddity, but the wisdom hidden like treasure within the folds of time. For the people of the Middle Ages, medicine wasn't a profession isolated in white-walled hospitals or studied under harsh fluorescent lights. It was life itself. Healing wasn't just about bodies, it was about souls, seasons, prayers, dreams. When a child fell ill, remedies came not just from the apothecary, but from the garden, the chapel, the kitchen, and even the stars. There was a kind of humility in this worldview, a reverence for nature, a reliance on the rhythms of the earth. And beneath the strangeness, we often find surprising insight. Let's return briefly to the herbs. Lavender, chamomile, valerians. Centuries ago, they were used for calming the spirit and settling the stomach. Today, we brew them in our teas, burn them in oils, or sleep beside them in soft sachets. The medieval healer may not have known the Latin names or chemical compounds, but their observations were born of patient experience. They watched, they listened. They passed their knowledge from grandmother to granddaughter, monk to novice, with careful hands and sacred intent. And the rituals, oh, the rituals! At first glance, they seem like superstition. The chants, the charms, the whispered invocations. But pause, and consider this. In a world without modern anesthesia, what power did belief itself hold? If you were told that burning sage above your feverish child could lift the illness, might that hope alone soothe your panic? Might the smell, the ceremony, the care have brought calm to the room and strength to the heart? In many ways, medieval medicine was as much about hope as it was about cure. Even bloodletting, long ridiculed, held within it the seed of a deeper understanding. The idea that something must be released to bring relief, that imbalance causes suffering, and restoration brings peace. Today we speak of detoxing, cleansing, resetting. The language has changed, but the yearning remains. And yes, there were charlatans, snake oil sellers, wandering quacks, frauds peddling powdered horn and miracle cures, but alongside them were dedicated midwives, wise women, and learned monks. They risked persecution to preserve ancient knowledge, copied texts by candlelight, and treated the sick with gentleness and skill. It was not all ignorance and fear. There was courage, too. Let's not forget that much of what modern medicine knows today is built upon stones laid in that shadowed time. The herbal texts of Hildegard, of Bignon, the translations of Galen preserved in monastic libraries, the early anatomical sketches, the mapping of fevers and wounds, the first tentative surgeries with bone needles and beeswax bandages, even the very structure of hospitals, has roots in medieval institutions, those early hospices run by nuns, those leper houses and plague shelters that offered not only treatment, but dignity. And how human those early treatments were. They smelled of thyme and garlic. They crackled in the fire. They were wrapped in wool and dipped in honey. They were sung in lullabies and carved in stone. When we think of medicine today, we think of pills and prescriptions. But medieval healing had texture, ritual, warmth. It was as much about comfort as it was about cure. There's something deeply moving in that, a reminder that to care for someone is not just to reduce their fever, but to hold their hand, not just to stitch the wound, but to light a candle, speak a prayer, make the room feel safe. And perhaps, despite all the knowledge we've gained, that lesson still lingers. Of course, the road here wasn't straight. Progress never is. Some cures failed, some killed, some were cruel, and others, surprisingly, worked far better than we'd expect. Moldy bread that fought infection, willow bark that soothed pain, leeches that saved dying tissue. Medieval medicine was not the absence of reason, but a different way of seeing. There is one more thing, to something softer. The relationship between the healer and the patient. In the Middle Ages, that bond was sacred. It wasn't rare for a healer to pray with their patient, to sing over them, to sit through the night just to keep watch. Medicine was not mechanical. It was musical, mystical, emotional. Let me tell you of one last tale before we drift into silence. A woman lies in a straw-stuffed bed in a village not far from the river Loire. Her fever is high. Her breath comes in gasps. Her husband, rough-handed but gentle-eyed, brings a local healer, a woman with streaks of silver in her hair, a pouch of herbs, and a quiet confidence. She places garlic beneath the woman's pillow, boils lavender in goat's milk, and holds the cup to cracked lips. She anoints her brow with oil infused with marigold, while whispering a psalm. And when the night deepens, she does not leave. She sits by the hearth, feeding the fire, watching the rise and fall of that fragile chest. In that moment, healing is not about textbooks or test results. It's about presence, faith, ritual, care. We are not so different now. We light candles. In hospitals, we stroke foreheads, we hum lullabies, we whisper, "You will be okay." That tender magic of comfort, it has survived all centuries, and so, as we close this strange and beautiful book of cures and customs, let's take with us not just the fascination of old treatments, but the deeper truth beneath them, that even in a time of shadows and plagues, of superstition and strange concoctions, the heart of healing has always been the same. To touch, to soothe, to sit beside someone in their hour of need and offer something, however small, that says, "You are not alone." Let that be the remedy we carry forward. And now, as your breath slows and the fire crackles low in the corners of your imagination, let this story settle over you like a warm cloak. You've walked through leech-laden rivers, knelt in herb gardens, and wandered the smoky halls of ancient infirmaries. The past, with all its strange wisdom, has whispered to you in the quiet of night. May that whisper stay with you not in fear or disbelief, but in gentle awe of those who came before and the stories they left behind. If this journey has helped you rest or dream a little deeper, do share your thoughts below, only if it feels right. And now sleep well, friend. The candles are out, the remedies are tucked away, and history hums quietly in the distance, waiting for us to return again.